European historian, so that mostly helps with obviously the post-contact information. We are in our main exhibit, Connecticut. So Connecticut is Algonquin. Think of Algonquin almost like Latin. It's a family of languages. So, for instance, a Schaghticoke person speaking to a Mohawk person. They have similar languages, however, certain nuances like adjectives are kind of lost, but the main verbs are understood. So the main gist of the conversation can probably be understood. Certain adjectives are probably a little bit lost. Very similar to how a Spanish and a French person speaks to each other. Can probably understand the gist of the conversation, but little nuances, they're going to be a little lost. So that's how I like to think of Algonquin. And because of that too, it depends who you speak to in regards to the pronunciation. It could be Connecticut or Quinnatucket. All depends. We go with Connecticut though, because it sounds like Connecticut, and that's where we get the state's name from. So really, it was also kind of probably butchered by the English that came here. They probably asked Native people, "What do you call this? Connecticut. How do you spell it?" And they probably tried to like spell it as phonetically as possible. So that's how we got Connecticut out of Connecticut. So a little bit lost again in translation, but you know, we got the gist of what it is. And technically it means land of the long water. The Connecticut River is huge, going all the way up into New Hampshire and Vermont. So that is technically what we would call this land. This room is really cool. It acts kind of like a timeline. So we're gonna jump 12,500 years into time during the last ice age. So, during the last ice age, if you can imagine where we're standing right now, 2 miles of ice would have been right above us. So, there were pockets of dry land during the ice age. A lot of people just think giant sheets of ice. No, not quite. There were giant glaciers. For instance, Connecticut and New York was pretty much a giant glacier. However, there were parts of Virginia that actually had grasslands. So that's why we were also able to have lots of different large megafauna, large animals, able to roam around this part of Connecticut. So we had mastodons, basically the equivalent to like an Asian elephant to an African elephant. So in this case, the African elephant would be the mammoth, the woolly mammoth. Mastodon was the smaller version. That's what we had in North America. Places like even modern day Russia, that's always kind of been more of a tundra, that's where woolly mammoths were. So they were not really here. There was probably small pockets of woolly mammoths. Mastodons were more prevalent though. We also had giant ground sloths, we had cave bears, and we had beavers over 8 feet long in this area. So people were up against huge animals. So we primarily know that they were hunting these animals because of the projectile points that we find. This giant table actually spans all periods of Native people. So all the way back towards the Ice Age would be the Paleo-Indian period. And that includes pretty much when we know that people were starting to come down here, which was around probably closer towards 13,000 years ago. But the oldest point we have is 12,500 years. We know that they were hunting animals not only because of these points, but because of oral histories. Oral histories fill in a lot of the blanks on how we know they were living. We can find some fossils of human skeletal remains. From my understanding, a lot have not been found in Connecticut because Connecticut has very acidic soil. So it breaks down a lot of organic materials. So really a lot of what's left is mostly stone and some fossils. A lot of the fossils we have found were one of the giant beaver. And we found a mastodon fossil in Farmington, Connecticut, and I believe Yukon currently owns that fossil. As to whether or not they're displaying it, I don't know. But I know that it was in Farmington, Connecticut. We found mastodon, which is kind of cool. We know that they were living only to about 35, very short lifespans. One, not only was it the difficult climate for one, but two, when you're hunting a giant animal, the likelihood that you're not going to be either severely injured or even killed is very unlikely. You also had, issues such as, again, illness, again, recovery from injuries, and also childbirth was also a big portion as to why they didn't live very long lifespans. Not to say that you couldn't live past 35. If you did, you were probably considered very well revered within your group because you really held a lot of knowledge if you can live up to, more than 35 at that time. At this point, they're living in very small, nomadic, familial groups. So probably no more than 20 people. So at this point, there's not a lot of knowledge in regards to cultural significances, what types of languages were spoken 12,000 years ago, and also kind of the concept of tribes probably didn't exist at that time because of these smaller communities. Tribes started really developing a lot later, probably actually considered more modern, around 3,000 years ago. So considering over 12,000 years of history, tribes as more of a concept in regards to governance as well as like nationality is very new and nuanced. Really cool. We did have a natural lake. We deemed it Lake Flushing. It's probably not called that. But during the Ice Age, because sea levels were much lower, we actually had a natural land bridge that connected Connecticut to Long Island. Now that is completely underwater, and this has more been filled in, so now that created the Long Island Sound, which is pretty cool. Yeah. But with, I believe it's called LiDAR, so it's kind of very intense sonar technology that can penetrate down through the water. They were able to find that there was a land bridge there. They had an inkling that there was, also because, again, of oral histories. Oral histories are extremely important, and I'm stressing that because with science, a lot of them were deemed, crazy, especially in giant beavers. There's no such thing as a giant beaver. No. Then they found a fossilized giant beaver. So a lot of the oral histories, even though they may have a lot of folklore around them, usually the root of the story is correct. Another very good one is that every tribal culture, specifically in this area, they have a story about the Great Flood. Great Flood can be found pretty much everywhere, all over the world. In the Bible, it's everywhere. So I always use that as an example of how important it actually is, because again, the Bible, oral history is passed down and then they finally were able to write it. So it's another kind of important piece to the puzzle, oral histories. So 8,000 years ago, at this point, the ice melted. Pros and cons to that. The pros being that because now the earth is warmer, there's more vegetation growing. So in this area in particular, this is where the forest environment began. And that was really good for us. Unfortunately, a lot of megafauna that had pre-existed during the Ice Age died out. So they died out for probably 3 reasons compounded together. A lot of people like to think it's one specific reason. There's many different factors. So one, not only was the Earth's climate changing so quickly that they couldn't evolve fast enough, so they probably died of heat exhaustion. Their food was no longer available, so they were dying out because they had no more food sources. But we were also hunting them. We were hunting them in large quantities to extinction. So with all 3, unfortunately, a lot of them died off. A random fact that I do know is there is one surviving Ice Age animal, the musk ox, primarily in parts of Alaska, Greenland, Antarctica. Huge, huge. It's kind of like a yak and a bison had a baby. To kind of describe how it looks. It's very interesting. And even to this day, a lot of tribal communities in Alaska, they do still hunt them, but they have a lot of laws and restrictions because now as the earth is getting warmer and warmer, a lot of them are dying out. So they do have some restrictions in regards to hunting them because they don't want them to go into extinction because they are a really good food source. So, random fact that I do know. But 8,000 years ago, now that the earth is getting warmer, not only do we have more vegetation, but at this point, it's only around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still pretty cold. So we were still having large animals coming into this area. Elk, caribou, grizzly bears were still coming into this area. Also, like mountain lions were probably still very prevalent in this area at this point. And we know that not only they were around because we tend to find specifically antler particles, but we know that they were around because they were making large points in order to hunt these large animals. This is an example of what is called a cache. So a cache is the equivalent of a storage unit or refrigerator 8,000 years ago. So a hunter usually sticks to what is called a migrational pattern. So if they're hunting deer, they would basically know that, well, if spring comes, they'll be in this specific area. So the next migration season, when they know they're going to be around, as long as they remembered where they marked the hole, they would basically have all of their points ready to go. They didn't have to make brand new ones every time, every season, because they already had them stored. So what's great about this is not only is it more convenient, but also if you are following that migrational pattern, you can actually have multiple caches pretty much anywhere. So it was a really big discovery. This was found actually, we do have some archaeologists on staff that still participate in archaeological digs. So in 1993, the Institute was involved in actually finding these points. So these points were found in Granby, Connecticut on a giant farm. The farmer basically called up the Archaeological Club of Litchfield and said, hey, there's a lot of points just popping up out of the ground, because he had a big rainstorm apparently the night before, so that eroded a lot of the soil to come up. And very rare find. We not only found this cache, but we found over 13 points completely intact. We probably found close to 40 just in that one cache. A lot of the others are unfortunately fragmented in our vault, but the ones that are not, we do have on display right here. So very, very unique and amazing find for sure. Last point I will make about this section is that at this point, because there's more vegetation, this is where we start including vegetation back into our diet. So if you do believe in the evolutionary theory, you know, if we evolved from apes at that point, millions of years ago, it was actually a warmer climate, so we were actually eating vegetation. And then we became meat eaters during the Ice Age when there wasn't a lot of vegetation growing. Our primary source was meat. Then, 8,000 years ago, once all that ice melted, we went back to being omnivores. So at many different periods, we actually changed in regards to also our gut evolution, which is very interesting. So that's where we find mortar and pestles coming in so that they can grind down that plant material. They probably did have fires. They probably had fires at night to keep them warm, primarily, but that's when they could cook or they could smoke meat. During the day, they were walking. So they were going where the food was. They didn't have any villages at this point or any settlements. So at this point, they were probably eating a majority of their food either pre-cooked, so like jerky, or they had to eat something raw. So that's where mortar and pestles really come in, because if you're having to eat very fibrous plants, you do want to grind it down to make it easier to chew. But when you grind it down, scientifically, you're releasing enzymes, making it easier to digest. So it's a 2-for-1 in regards to grinding down your food. Around 5,000 years ago, the Earth is getting even warmer. Yay. It's probably closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So because it's warmer, all of the glacial cracks left in the Earth after the Ice Age, because glaciers are constantly moving, was filled in with water. And New England is very well known for our beautiful rivers and lakes. And so this is where fishing technologies really take off. They were probably eating fish prior to this, but they were probably most likely spearing fish from the shore. They probably did have canoes. However, the oldest we have ever found was only dated to 5,000 years. And that's because of the theory. There are 3 theories as to how people technically got to North America. One being that they crossed the Great Bering Strait and disseminated down. The other being that they basically actually came from Polynesia. And because they were already seafaring people and they were island hopping, they eventually found actually the northwest corner, so Washington, Oregon. And they realized there's plenty here, we no longer have to island hop, and that's where they started establishing settlements. Another theory too is that they actually migrated up from South America. And that's because archaeologists, this is very highly debated, mind you, have found sites that they believe are 45,000 years old. Very heavily debated, because again, very few believe this, majority do not. So I will preface that. But we most likely think that actually all 3 occurred probably close to around the same time. So it's very likely that they had canoes prior to 5,000 years, but the oldest ever found was 5,000. So at this point too, we can also start dating, again, more fishing technologies being developed, because now they're able to really go out on the water. So canoe making, very interesting process. You find a tree. Most canoes were around 30 feet. So this is not an accurate replication by any means. They were much larger. They were 30 feet, if not larger. Not only did we have more oxygen in the air 5,000 years ago, but also we didn't have large populations of people, so there were lots of trees that were able to grow significantly large. Usually, if you wanted to stay on one major waterway, you would use poplar. So poplar trees tend to be very heavy. Around 30 feet, canoes can weigh anywhere from 350 to 500 pounds. Very heavy. However, if you wanted to kind of river hop, so to speak, or create almost like a taxi, you would use birch bark. So, birch bark is very lightweight. It peels in multiple layers. So also, you can also use birch bark if you don't want to kill the tree. Any other tree where you would want to peel the bark off, it dies, because then the inner corium of the tree is exposed and it dies, unfortunately. However, you would use the whole tree if you're making a canoe. So what they would do is once they did find a tree, they would take some mud or clay, make a ring around the bottom of the tree, and set the tree on fire on one side, and it slowly burns the tree. By doing that, you're taking away the work of having to hack it down with a stone axe for days, if not weeks. It completes the process a lot faster. Probably in a couple of hours, the tree is dead. Then you can cut it down the rest of the way. Then you make a small smoldering fire, and you slowly hollow out the inside. If you were very, 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 very dedicated, you could probably do this process within a couple of days. Mashantucket Pequot Museum did this last October for their patrons. They did it through a 3-week process. But mind you, it's because they would do a demonstration stop and then do another demonstration the week after. So probably would have taken them, if they really actually were dedicated, probably only a couple days. And really cool too, the ash created through the burning process also seals the bark. If you wanted extra seal, you could also take fat from an animal, boil that down into an oil, and spread that on there, and that would also make it not only more aerodynamic in the water, but also create a seal. So those are certain ways that they could also make it last longer, I should say. They were doing a process called scuttling. So what that means is after the season is over for fishing, so probably around, actually around this time of year would be the perfect time to actually pretty much stop fishing. You would fill the canoe with rocks. You and a group of buddies would take it out into the river and sink it. Rivers in particular, because it's constantly moving water, they stay a fairly consistent temperature, and the water is always fresh. So there's less likely to be algae or different fungi infecting the canoe. Mind you, because canoes can be up to 500 pounds, then filling it with rocks is very heavy. And you would have to know where you dropped it, and then you would have to pull it back out. But basically, it petrifies the wood. It preserves the wood over long periods of time. So that's actually why we were able to find canoes in the Long Island Sound dated 5,000 years ago, because of that petrifying process. We have found a couple in like local lakes, like Lake Warmog, not any man-made ones, and a couple of rivers. Unfortunately though, the state of Connecticut has over 900 dams. So with all the building of the dams, probably a lot were either destroyed or already excavated by that point. And most of our dams were built by the early 1900s, late 1800s. So by that point, they were either destroyed because of all the dredging process, or they were already found by that point. So it's pretty rare if you actually do find one. You're very lucky if you do. But now that they're able to travel more, they're able to fish more efficiently. So we know that they were using nets. This net is made out of dogbane, which is a type of swamp plant. When I usually say dogbane, people are like, dog hair? But dogbane is a swamp plant. The reason why you'd want to use swamp plants is they have a lot of water content, so they can expand and contract without snapping. So it makes a great net. We know they were using them because we tend to find rocks that are shaped almost like an 8. We actually have them in the case, so if you want to get a little closer, you can. They made little notches on the side, and that way they could tie it down, throw it in, sinks down, and then you can catch probably more like crayfish down at the bottom. They were probably also, I believe the term is line fishing. So you just take either some sinew, or you could also make another rope out of different type of swamp materials. And then you would tie it to a hook. Most of the hooks are actually made out of animal bone, because bones are softer and much more pliable because of the marrow compared to a stone. And also stones, if you shape them in that kind of hook shape, they're probably more likely to actually break rather than a bone. So lots of different animal bones were used for the hooks as well as even the spears. And at this point, we also know that they were using atlatls. So atlatls are technically a Paleo-Indian technology. So this was back during the Ice Age. The reason why we know that they were using them more prevalently 5,000 years ago is because we find what are called atlatl weights, and that is made out of stone. So the weight would actually go on the back, and that would be your counter when you went to go throw it. So this is a very fancy atlatl. You could technically make an atlatl in like 15 minutes. All you have to do is like take a stick and just make a little notch. But basically this is a spear thrower. So you would attach the spear. Spears could be up to 10 feet. So spears could be very, very big. And depending on who's throwing it, you do have different sizes of weights as counterweights. Basically you attach it, you pinch it, throw it. It increases the speed tenfold and it increases the force tenfold. So let's say I wanted to hunt Boo Boo the bear there. I could technically hunt him myself. I don't need a large group of people to corner the bear and pick someone brave enough to then go stab him. I could technically hunt him myself. Now, the likelihood I could probably spear through the bear, unlikely, but if I at least speared the bear and I was far enough away, the bear might try to charge me, but I could dodge it. And then after a while, I could track him. Once he keels over, because he's too far injured, too far gone, I could finish the kill. So that's primarily how they were able to then hunt. So the atlatl was an amazing revolutionary tool. And it's also considered a phenomenon. It was developed by every indigenous culture all over the world at the same time. So very rare. Usually every culture eventually develops similar technologies or a technology that could be compared in some ways to others, but it's very rarely at the same time. And that's simply because of the size of the civilization, so to speak, there. So, okay. And the last little bit I'm going to mention in regards to the 5,000 year timeline is we do tend to find some remnants of what are called weirs. So weirs are typically shaped like a V on rivers, and that's because of sturgeons, salmon, spawning fish. That way you could capture the fish. So this is actually a perfect diagram of what that would have been like to its full capacity. So you would take a lot of rocks, make a little V shape, but have a little gap. And you would probably be on the other side in a canoe, probably either spearfishing or throwing nets in order to then catch the spawning salmon. We tend to find some remnants of them. Unfortunately, we don't find a lot because, again, of dredging of a lot of rivers. And also when dams are built, if they don't destroy what has already pre-existed, there's different levels then of water. So a lot of them could possibly also be underwater if they weren't dredged anyways. So that's why we only find very few remnants, especially in the state of Connecticut. 2,500 years, probably closer towards 3,000 years, is the establishment of villages and the establishment of tribes. Villages in the state of Connecticut were much smaller in comparison to Iroquois or Huron-Shawnee tribal villages. Huron-Shawnee probably had closer towards 400 people per village. Here we had maybe 100, 150, not much more than that. So our tribes were much smaller, and our population overall was much smaller than upstate New York. And at this point, not only was the villages smaller, but we tended to also have much smaller housing structures. So for instance, the Haudenosaunee would probably have one huge longhouse which housed everybody in the village. It was much more effective that way. You could clear out X amount of land, build a long structure, everyone's housed inside. However, here we didn't have to clear a lot of land in order to build our structures, and instead we had what are called wigwams, so small individual housing structures for individual families, and a smaller longhouse for the sachem or chief. Chiefs could be male or female, it did not matter, and it wasn't naturally hereditary. You had to prove your right to be chief. So it was very, very democratic, actually. You had to go through the Women's Council, the War Council, and the Elders Council in order to be chief. And very much like modern day politics, however, not to say that there wasn't probably one line of chiefs. Even today, the Schaghticoke, for instance, a lot of their chiefs usually come from one family. So it's possible that one family probably ruled for many, many, many years, and then maybe it switched to a different family. Just like senators today. And this is actually a primary example of actually how big the longhouse was. So longhouses aren't super duper huge, but because they are the largest structure, they had many, many purposes and functions. So it was the home of the sachem and their family, but it was also the church, town hall, hospital, all in one. So any type of ceremony was held in the longhouse. Any type of debate or issue was settled in the longhouse. And because it's the largest space, whoever was sick or injured, the medicine man or medicine woman could work on the patient there. So the chief willingly would offer up their home so that somebody could easily have better treatment. At this point, I do want to side note that because they had lived here for thousands of years at this point, they pretty much knew which plants they could eat safely, which plants cured what. I love to use the example of moss. Moss is a natural anticoagulant. So if you're bleeding, you put some moss on. So they knew what cured what. And at this point, they don't have a ton of viruses. They probably more have bacterial infections. So that's why they were able to cure certain illnesses more effectively. So at this point also, because of that, they're living around 55. So this is where we start seeing life expectancy going up. And around this point, because all villages need to be by a water source, I always stress that. We have a replicated village outside. I can't tell you how many people ask me, was this actually here? No. Mile down the road by Steep Rock River, absolutely. We actually have a lot of archaeological evidence that there were villages along Steep Rock River. They're not going to travel for water, for one, especially if you have 150 people. You need it right there. Also, being by a river source, you are able to travel, fish more effectively. Also, your radius of hunting is much smaller because animals are also naturally more attracted to the water. So there's a lot of benefits. Another major benefit, and this is where we start seeing it in the archaeological record, they changed from stone to pottery at this point because they're living by water. So lots of different clays are obviously used for pottery, but what makes it really cool is actually archaeologists can pinpoint where these pots were made based off the type of clay. All different clay has different types of sediment in it, so you can actually pinpoint where it came from, which is really cool. I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't do that. And it takes a lot of time to painstakingly rebuild a pot. Usually, it could take up to years. And that's because you might find a little bit, then you have to go back to the site, find more. So usually you also don't find everything in one shot. You find it over multiple archaeological digs in order to find all the missing pieces. So we do have a couple of pots that have been rebuilt, or at least partially rebuilt, and then we used a resin cast to complete it. And at this point, tribal culture also really starts flourishing and developing. The easiest way for me personally to describe what a tribe is again, I'm a European historian by training. So I like to think of it almost like everybody considers themselves the people. All tribal names usually translate to the people. So I think of it almost like Renaissance Italy. They're all Italians, but I'm from Naples, I'm from Venice, I'm from Florence. So there's still some distinction. And that's because of this need not only to create almost like a nation state, but also this need for self-identity. I think that's just a very inherent need within the human psyche of just wanting to know where we are in relation to the world and how we connect. So I think that's very big just in her human nature. So that's not only how they culturally operate, but also how they operate very in general as almost like a modern day nation state. Because with that, you also have protection in certain resources depending where the tribe is. So certain tribes, for instance, like the Sept, because they're right on, right on the Long Island Sound, they are the primary, I don't know the right term. They're able to get all of the wampum. They're able to get a lot more seaweed, shellfish. So things that are actually very highly not only commodable in regards to trade, but also for nutrition. They are the primary holders of that. So then in regards to also trading, they have an upper hand based off of that resource. So that's also another layer too. We're gonna move to 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, this is where we start seeing horticulture or gardening coming in. And gardening was a huge asset. Not only could they now establish 2 permanent villages, so to speak. So what I mean by that is they would usually have a spring-summer village where they were lower in the valleys, and then they would move to higher ground for specifically winter in particular. And that's because actually higher ground, even though there's more elevation, so more snow, at least the snow has somewhere to go. If you're in a valley, you don't want to be trapped where it's snowing, because then all your housing structures might get destroyed, and it's going to be a lot harder to then even move out if you wanted to. So higher ground is actually better. But in the permanent village, in the valley, this is where a lot of their gardening was. Corn, beans, and squash, also known as succotash, the 3 sisters, was extremely important, not only culturally, but nutritionally. You have your fats, proteins, and carbs all in one. So when food was scarce, or you had already gone through your provisions of, bear jerky and what have you, you could reconstitute the 3 sisters, and that could still feed the people during the winter time. So it was still extremely important nutritionally. And Connecticut was the first state of New England to actually acquire corn. We received corn through different trade networks all the way down from the Inca Empire. So the Inca Empire, they pretty much genetically modified to what corn is today. Corn actually grows out of the ground naturally as a little blade of grass, no bigger than this. So actually through cross-germination, they were able to create giant kernels of corn. So corn is probably one of the oldest genetically modified plants really on the planet. Without human interaction with it, would have never grown like this, ever. Same thing with certain types of potatoes. They love potatoes. Wow, do they love potatoes? 650 varieties of potatoes. So we also got potatoes, and we also got legumes from the Inca as well. We did naturally already have squash. Most of our natural squash would be pumpkins, different gourds, acorn squash, so along those lines. Zucchini, summer squash are actually not native here. That is actually the one native plant that comes from the Mediterranean. All other plants like tomatoes are not native to Italy. And I know I'm Italian. It broke my heart when I learned that. But it's actually a South American plant. And then it was through basically the transatlantic trade brought over to Italy. And same thing with potatoes. A lot of people are like, Irish potatoes. No, that was brought to Ireland. So yeah, corn was the first to be brought to Connecticut, and then we actually then distributed it to Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, the rest of parts of New England. And we actually, through the trade, but also through trial and error, learned how to properly plant it. So you plant the corn first. You let that sprout. Then you have the beans surrounding it, and you make a little mound. And the beans wrap around the corn like a little trellis. And the squash, because of their large leaves, protect any weeds from growing. Scientifically also, it takes nitrogen out, corn and beans, and squash puts it back in. So that's actually how they're also companion plants together. So not only nutritionally are they great, but they're also really awesome to just plant together because they'll survive together. Mind you, you do need a lot of land to cultivate the Three Sisters, and traditionally they probably would have used actually a fish head to keep the soil really rich before even planting them. And at this point too, they were also, because they were able to have better nutrition through gardening, hunting and gathering, and fishing, they were now able to live up to 70 years old. So they're probably comparatively one of the healthiest populations on the planet. Comparatively to like Europe, they were living only to like 40, unless you were upper class. And even upper class was dying at pretty alarming rates because of actually gout and diabetes, which again was brought in by nutrition. And then they also had hereditary problems as well. But that was primarily the major ways that we can also cross-examine. 450 years ago, unfortunately, this is where things go downhill. The Dutch were the first to arrive to, I would say, Albany. They eventually came down to Connecticut, but they first established a port colony in Albany. Traditionally, it's Mohawk territory. And they primarily were going to find beaver. So beaver is naturally waterproof, and it's very warm. And it's also, during the time that they came, which is around 1603, it's considered a status symbol. So the upper class wanted beaver pelts because it distinguished you from the lower classes. And I mean, I'm not justifying it by any means, but in Europe, even today, it rains all the time. So you do want a fur that is naturally waterproof to protect you from the rain so that you're not wet, soggy, and cold. So when they found that the Mohawk had plenty of beaver, that they were around. They asked them, can you hunt them in exchange? We will give you copper pots. We will give you glass. We will give you porcelain. So we will give you other types of commodities. Copper pots in particular was a really great commodity at first. Why? Because pottery, if it falls, it breaks. Copper, it dents, so it doesn't break. It's still very easy to make, and it heats very quickly. However, this might be a weird question. If you've ever tasted a penny or you bit your tongue, that talc-y taste, that's what copper does to your food. So then after a while, Native people hated it, and they actually, when they got it, they would carve it up and make it into jewelry. They would do anything other than cooking with it, which did not go well with the Dutch. Also, the Dutch eventually, around 1625, they started coming down into Connecticut and were working with the Pequots. So the Pequots traditionally were much larger. Today, 3 separate tribes because of unfortunately the Pequot War. But prior to that, they were one large nation that were on the coast. So they were the primary source of wampum. So wampum traditionally is a gift of honor. It's a gift of honor because it takes over 1 day to make 1 bead. And that's because you're using stone drills to drill holes into the quahog shell. This is a quahog shell. Very prized and sought after for its beautiful indigo color. And primarily, it was also used too because once you were able to sand it, it gets nice and smooth. How they would usually operate is after a trade happened for certain commodities, you would honor the trade by giving wampum. The Dutch saw this and said, that's your money, that's how you're paying for it, got it. And that's when they went down to the Pequots and said, I want you to make as much wampum as possible. So that way I can make sure that the Mohawk continue getting beaver for us. And then through that mass production, it slowly devalued what was once a gift of honor, unfortunately. Something I also like to bring up, again, it gets very dark at this point. This is called a kaolin pipe. So kaolin is a type of clay, ceramic. This was mass produced in the 17th century by the English. So the reason why it was so long, Europeans understood at a rudimentary level the concept of germs. They lived with plagues for thousands of years at that point. So I smoke my bit, break it off, I can pass it to you. So we tend to find all little fragments all over the shores in particular, because that's where most of the colonies were set up by torts, mostly. So that's where we can find them. You can still find them today if you dig really deep. At Hammonasset, you could probably find little shards of kaolin pipes. At this time, during just this trade, 80% of the native population was wiped out due to germs brought over by the Dutch and the English. Measles and smallpox were the major killers. So to native people, this is known as the time of Great Dying, the Great Dying. So there was estimated around 3 million native people in New England, not in the state of Connecticut. So I'm not particularly amazing at math, but 80% of that was wiped out. So significant number of people. What is often not taught or talked about is not only were they wiped out because they had no immunity, but the way in which Native people operated and lived was a major contributor as well. They lived in extremely tight communities. If one person was sick, the whole village would work together to make that person feel better. I mean, you'd have even children bringing tea or soup. So that virus spread like wildfire. So a village could be infected and die out within 3 weeks. Those that did survive, so usually people around my age, I'm around 27, would probably live. However, there would be reproductive repercussions. So for males, if I'm not mistaken, smallpox decreases sperm count. In women, I believe measles causes scarring on your uterus. So there were many ways that it also then had repercussions in regards to reproduction. Women and men then couldn't have children afterward. So it was a really big impact to the Native community. And then to kind of compound issues, we then also had the Pequot War. So the Pequot War really was kind of a skirmish really between the English and the Dutch. And the Pequot were kind of caught in the middle and had to choose sides. So the Dutch were going in and out all the time of Albany. The English, by 1633, had already established patrols. I wouldn't say a full colony per se, but definitely at least a patrol port on Block Island. So at one point the Dutch were kind of going in and out near Block Island, and the Dutch and the English had never really gotten along. There was already a lot of different political issues in regards to the English sending nonconformists out to the Netherlands and Denmark. There was issues in regards to also, at this point, the Dutch, they were extremely powerful in regards to the East India Trading Company. They pretty much monopolized a lot of the trade commodities by this point. So the English, which was the strongest navy at the time, were in really big contention with the East India Trading Company. So there was already issues brewing. So the Dutch tried kind of going through Block Island. That was a big problem for the English, and they actually started striking against the Dutch coming in and out. The Dutch tried blockading Block Island so that then the English couldn't get out. Big issue. How the Pequot were involved is basically the Pequot were providing not only trade goods to the Dutch, but also trade goods to the English. So they were already just doing that just because. But then what became an issue was now that the English and the Dutch are at war over just Block Island, hey, you gotta pick sides. So then some people chose the Dutch, some people chose the English, and some stayed neutral. And to this day, what was once much larger is now 3 separate. However, they can probably all trace their ancestry back to Pequot, just Pequot. There are other types of issues going on. I am not Native, so I am not privy to those problems, but there are always some intertribal problems going on as well. That could also be the reason as to why there are still 3 separate nations, more than just Pequot War. So it goes even farther into it. But I love using this map as a primary great, showcase of, this was all before colonial contact. We had well over 15 tribes, just in the state of Connecticut alone. And this is just a rough estimate too, because tribes, again, they're not just, settling in one area. They're still moving around for different resources. So this is just a rough estimate of who established the longest in one particular area. After the Great Dying, so many had died that really a lot were destroyed, or they were forced out. We had our own version of the Trail of Tears. So the Mohegan, different than Mohegan, a lot of people get them confused, they were actually transplanted out into Ohio. So a lot of tribes, not only did they suffer from this period of great dying, but they were also marched out, or they were forced to consolidate because of this period of great dying. So Weantinuck, parts of Pootutuck, Tunxis, all became part of the Schaghticoke tribal nation. So the Schaghticoke are a mishmash of many different tribes that were forced to consolidate under one tribe. Probably not considered forced, they probably very willingly came together. But under such circumstances, there was kind of this implement of like, we kind of should get together if we want to stay alive. So they are probably the closest currently to us with a reservation. Their reservation is in Kent. There's a huge misconception that because we're in Connecticut, reservation land must be much better than out west. No. The Schaghticoke, they have 118 acres. More than 100 of them are cliffs. So you can't have any houses or really do anything on cliffs. So most tribal members don't live physically on the reservation. A lot of them live elsewhere. So Darlene, for instance, she lives in Newtown. Doesn't live anywhere near Kent. But they usually do use the reservation though as like a gathering place for them. Golden Hill Bagusset. They have the oldest reservation actually in the United States. It was gifted, I believe, don't 100% quote me on this, in 1638 in Colchester. It was 1/4 of an acre for over 2,000 people to live on. Here you go. To this day, they still legally own it. Mind you, in the 90s, they actually had to fight for it because some neighbor claimed this 1/4 of an acre. No, it's mine. And they had to go to court and be like, no, it's ours. And I actually recently asked them, why did you feel the need to fight for this 1/4 of an acre? And they were like, any land we deserve to have. So they still legally own it. They have a little historical center and a plaque, because what else do you do with 1/4 of an acre? They were eventually gifted in, I believe, 1858, 118 acres in Trumbull. And probably better land, I should say, belonged to Mashantucket, Pequot, and Mohegan, primarily. And that's because when they were establishing Foxwoods and Mohegan, the casinos, they were already kind of grandfathered in to have a lot of their revenue go directly to the tribe. There's a huge misconception that if tribes have casinos, they make a ton of money. No, most of that money goes to the federal government. It doesn't actually go back to the tribe. Only about 20% of all casino holding tribes actually profit. So it's very low numbers. So it's actually considered great that we actually have two casinos operating that actually make revenue. It's actually very surprising. And we have a good relationship with all the tribes. We are not specifically tribally affiliated, our museum, but because this is the Connecticut Room, we try to represent these tribes to the best of our ability and in a respectful way. So we oftentimes will consult with them in regards to how we, not only educationally, but culturally are representing them. So we do have a fairly good relationship with all of our tribes. We do want to continue strengthening that relationship, so that is something that we're going to continue building throughout this year and the next coming years. And we're trying to use our Native representatives or Native people that work here currently to help build that connection. There's a lot of again, intertribal issues. So sometimes it's difficult to get everybody in the same room to work together. So, but we're going to continue kind of pushing that and trying to kind of build that relationship.
The body won't change, the body